A man was shot, but the gun never fired. How is that possible? Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Let's grow this community. Comment below and tell me where you're tuning in from. I always enjoy reading your messages. Don't be shy. Let's begin. It was just after 8 on a Tuesday morning, and Maigret was waiting for his second cup of coffee. Madame Maigret had gone out early, to the butcher, perhaps, or to visit her cousin in Ivry, and the apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir was quiet in that particular way Paris can be quiet, as if holding its breath before another slow day begins. From the window he watched the rain bead on the iron balcony rail, a faint shimmer forming where the city blurred into itself. The radio muttered softly in the kitchen. Not the news. She always switched it to the music program once the weather was done. A cello murmured something slow and patient, which suited his mood. He lit a pipe and let it hang from the corner of his mouth, unlit for now, and settled into the chair by the window with a folded copy of L'Étang on his lap. Unopened dot, something about the morning unsettled him. Not in any grand way, just a small itch behind the eyes. It might have been the rain. It might have been the way the building across the street looked slightly different, like someone had changed the curtains in the third-floor window. It was then the telephone rang. He let it ring twice. He always did. On the third he rose, joints stiff, crossed to the narrow hallway, and answered. Maigret. A familiar voice crackled on the other end. Inspector Janvier, sounding unsure of himself. Sorry to disturb you at home, Chief. It's not a case yet, not officially. But the commissaire thought you might want to hear. Maigret didn't respond. He just waited, one hand resting on the edge of the telephone table where Madame Maigret kept a small brass vase of dried lavender. There was a man found early this morning, in Montparnasse, in one of those little heddles on Rue d'Alembert, room 17. He was sitting in a chair, looked asleep, but he was dead. Maigret let out a breath. Heart? Possibly. No signs of struggle, no wounds, except, well, the concierge says she heard a gunshot in the night, around 2. Only forensics say there's no bullet, no damage, no shell, and the man had no gun. Just a coat, a book, and a single glove. Maigret was silent a moment longer. Was the window open? No, locked, and the room's on the third floor. Did anyone else hear the shot? Only her, and she's hard of hearing. Maigret looked out the window again. The rain was heavier now, softening the outlines of everything. He could picture it already, the narrow hallway, the damp smell of gas heaters, the desk lamp left on all might beside a man who looked like he might still be breathing. All right, he said. I'll come. He hung up the phone slowly. Then he returned to the kitchen, poured the rest of the lukewarm coffee into a chipped porcelain cup, and drank it without sugar. The toast was cold and too dark. Madame Maigret would have thrown it out, but he didn't. It was the kind of morning where even bad toast made sense. Outside, Paris went on dripping. He pulled on his coat, the heavy gray one that made him look a little older than he was, and stepped out into the street. There was no urgency in his step, just a heaviness in the way he carried his umbrella, like a man who had walked through a great many quiet tragedies and suspected he might be on his way to another. And as he reached the corner, past the Tata and the old man setting out crates of oranges, Maigret paused under the awning of a closed cafe. He didn't know why yet, but he already didn't like the sound of this case. The hotel was one of those narrow buildings squeezed between a bookshop and a shuttered cafe, its stone facade the color of wet chalk, streaked with age and soot. A brass plaque by the door announced Hotel de la Méridien, though the sea was nowhere near, and neither the brass nor the building had seen polish in years. Maigret stood beneath the striped awning, shaking the rain from his umbrella. The doorman, if one could call him that, was nowhere in sight. A woman with a checked apron hovered near the entrance, pretending to sweep the front steps, but watching him closely. Inside, the air smelled of boiled cabbage and cheap disinfectant. The wallpaper was peeling in spots, and a framed landscape painting hung slightly crooked behind the reception desk. Janvier was there in a damp trench coat, flipping through a ledger. He straightened up when he saw Maigret and gestured toward the stairs. 3rd floor, room 17. The medical examiner's on his way. No one's touched anything. Maigret nodded and took the stairs slowly. He preferred stairs to elevators. Elevators felt like shortcuts, and shortcuts didn't suit him. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, and with each step he caught fragments of sound behind the closed doors. A cough, the clink of a cup, the muted hum of a radio playing accordion music. Room 17 was at the end of a narrow corridor. The door stood open, and a gendarme leaned against the wall nearby, yawning into his hand. The room was small but tidy. A single bed, crisply made, a wooden chair by the window, and a writing table with a thin lamp still switched on. The light had a dull yellow glow, barely touching the corners of the room. A man sat in the chair, legs crossed, one arm resting on the window sill, his head tilted slightly as if he were listening to the rain. He could have been asleep. Maigret stepped closer. The man was in his 50s, perhaps 60, with graying hair and a narrow face. He wore a dark suit with a faint pinstripe, slightly rumpled at the collar. His eyes were open, but there was nothing behind them. His skin had the pale, heavy stillness of death. Janvier entered behind him. The concierge says she heard a shot sometime after 2, sharp like a pistol, but no one else seems to have heard it. Maigret looked at the man again. Name registered as Paul Gendreau. No address listed. Paid cash for 2 nights. Checked in yesterday afternoon. Luggage? Janvier shook his head. Just a folded coat in the closet. A book of poetry on the table. Pervert. And a glove. 1. Maigret moved to the writing table. The book lay open, spine cracked, a dog-eared page marked with a metro ticket. Beside it sat a small notepad, blank, and a hotel pen with its cap chewed off. He noticed a half-smoked cigarette in the ashtray, still faintly scented, but no pack, no lighter, no wallet either. He bent slightly, peering at the windowsill. There was a smear of condensation where the man's arm had rested. But the window was locked from the inside, the frame swollen slightly from the rain. Did you check the floorboards? Janvier knelt and ran a hand over the worn wooden slats. Nothing loose, no sign of a hidden weapon, no shell casing, no bullet, hole in the walls, no sign of a gun at all. He murmured. Maigret stayed quiet, glancing back at the man's face. He'd seen death many times, but this one was curious. There was no fear in it, no surprise. If anything, the expression was expectant. He turned and opened the small closet. The coat hung there neatly, a wool overcoat with a faint smell of pipe smoke. The pockets were empty, save for a torn handkerchief and a stub of pencil. Something about the room bothered him. It was clean. Not just neat, too clean, as if someone had made a point of erasing themselves. Except they'd left the man behind. Maigret turned back to Janvier. What do we know about him? Nothing yet. No ID, no key in his pocket, though the door was locked from the inside when the concierge found him. We had to use the master key to get in, so either he locked it himself, or someone else did and left no trace. Maigret nodded slightly, as if to himself. He walked once more around the room slowly, feeling the quiet. It doesn't feel like a suicide. He said finally, No? No, it feels like someone left him here, but not in a hurry. Not ashamed either. Janvier frowned. Then why the story about a gunshot? Maigret didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the door, then stopped and looked back once more at the figure in the chair. Rain tapped softly on the window. The cigarette in the ashtray gave off its last ghost of smoke. Maigret turned to Janvier. Let's speak to the concierge. Would you like me to generate Section 3 next? The concierge was waiting downstairs, perched on a stool behind a worn wooden counter that held a brass bell, a chipped ceramic ashtray, and a half-finished crossword puzzle in a dog-eared magazine. She had a sour expression and wiry gray hair gathered in a bun that was coming undone in the damp dot. She had already lit her second galois of the morning, the smoke curling lazily toward the low ceiling. Her eyes, sharp and yellowish, followed Maigret as he descended the stairs and stepped into the cramped lobby. She was in her late 60s. Maigret guessed maybe 70, with the indignant energy of someone who had kept a building running by sheer force of will for too long. Her cardigan was buttoned all the way up, despite the heat from the ancient radiator groaning behind her. Madame, Maigret said with a small nod. I understand you found the guest in room 17? She stubbled out her cigarette and waved vaguely toward the ceiling. I found him because no one else would. The girl was supposed to bring breakfast up. I told her not to, but she said he hadn't come down, and she didn't want trouble. And you heard a sound during the night? She nodded, tapping her ear. I'm not deaf, you know. Just a little fuzzy in the left one from a childhood fever. I was reading in bed. I always read before sleep. Helps settle the nerves. Around 2, I heard it. Sharp, like a firecracker, but closer. Too close. A gunshot? It's not the first I've heard in my life, she said, with a touch of Persian disdain. I've lived through 2 wars and a divorce. Yes, it was a gunshot. But no one else in the building heard it? She shrugged. They're heavy sleepers, these types. Young people, students, tourists, ears full of jazz and whiskey. Or maybe they did hear it and just didn't want to get involved. That's more likely. Maigret leaned slightly on the counter, pulling his pipe from his coat pocket. He didn't light it. He only held it thoughtfully. Tell me about Monsieur Gendreau. Had you seen him before? Never. Walked in yesterday just before 5, alone. Looked respectable enough. Quiet. Didn't say much. Paid cash up front 2 nights. Did he speak with anyone else? Not that I saw. Went straight to his room. Came down once around 7. I think. Asked if there was a newspaper kiosk nearby. Didn't buy one from me. That was it. Maigret frowned slightly. Did he eat here? No, said he wasn't hungry. I offered tea. He said no, thanked me, and went back up. That's the last I saw of him until this morning. Did you go into the room alone? She hesitated, then raised her chin. Yes, I knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Then I used the key. I don't like doing that, but I smelled something odd. Not gas, something else. Stale. I found him sitting just like that. Not a mark on him, just still. Who else has access to the keys? Only me, she said firmly. And the girl who helps in the mornings, but she doesn't touch the master key. She's afraid of it. Maigret nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch. The concierge lit another cigarette with the practiced flick of a match. He looked around. The lobby. There were postcards for sale in a small rotating stand, faded views of the Eiffel Tower and Notre Dame. A framed notice warned guests not to leave valuables unattended. Above the desk, a wall of wooden cubbyholes held spare keys and envelopes. Most were empty. One had a green scarf neatly folded inside. You keep guests' belongings here? If they ask, she said, or if they forget them. That scarf's been there since October. He turned back to her. Would you mind if we spoke with the girl, the one who helps you? She comes in at 10, doesn't stay long, just does the breakfast trays and runs a cloth over the floor. She's not clever, but she's honest. Her name? Gisette. From down the block, lives with her aunt. Maigret thanked her and stepped back. Janvier, who had lingered near the door, moved closer as they exited into the street, which was still damp but no longer raining. The morning had settled into that dull, pale gray that made Paris feel like a city seen through old glass. Maigret lit his pipe at last. She believes what she's saying, he murmured, but there's something too firm about it. Janvier adjusted his collar. Too firm? She's rehearsed it. She wants it to sound unimpeachable. But people don't remember small things so cleanly unless they've told the story more than once, to themselves or someone else. They began walking, slowly, nowhere in particular. Maigret liked to think best when moving. He watched the way the water pooled in the cracks between the cobblestones, the way the smoke from his pipe curled behind them like a lazy animal. No bullet, Janvier said quietly. No wound, no gun, but she swears she heard it. You think she's lying? Not entirely, but perhaps she's mistaken. Or perhaps she wants us to believe something that isn't true, because it's simpler. Janvier looked skeptical. Simpler than what? That's what we don't know yet. They turned back toward the hotel just as the church bells chimed 10. A narrow figure in a blue raincoat approached, carrying a plastic tray of croissants under one arm and a shopping bag in the other. Gisette? Janvier asked. The girl stopped and looked at them with wide, surprised eyes. She was no more than 20, thin and pale, with chapped hands and frizzy hair pulled into a loose braid. She nodded uncertainly. We're police, Maigret said gently. Just a few questions, nothing to be afraid of. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. All right. Inside the lobby, the concierge gestured her, and with a look that said, Be careful what you say. Maigret noticed. They stood in the corner while Yusette deposited the croissants and peeled off her coat. Did you see the man in room 17? No, sir, only his door. I was going to bring breakfast up, but Madame said she'd do it. Had you seen him yesterday? I think so. Maybe once. Around dinner time. I was cleaning near the stairs. He walked past me, but didn't say anything. Did you hear anything unusual last night? A loud noise? She frowned. No, I sleep upstairs, above the hotel, in the attic. You can hear the plumbing, and sometimes the radio, but I didn't hear anything loud. Maigret nodded, watching her face. She was nervous, but not evasive. He didn't think she was hiding anything, at least. Not yet. As they left the building once more, the clouds had begun to break apart, letting in patches of pale sunlight. Maigre, E.T. didn't speak for several minutes. Then she didn't hear the shot. No, and no one else did either. Only the concierge. Maigret exhaled through his nose, a long, slow breath that misted in the morning air. Then either the shot never happened, he said, almost to himself, or it happened long before anyone expected it. He tapped his pipe out against the wall, quietly thoughtful. We'll need to know more about Paul Gendreau. Whoever he was, he came here for a reason. Should I check the station records? Maybe he had priors. Yes, and the telephone company. Let's see if he made any calls. Discreetly. Janvier nodded and walked off, the wet pavement reflecting his retreating steps. Maigret lingered a moment longer outside the Hotel de la Méridien, looking up at the windows like a man reading an unfamiliar sentence in a very old book. That afternoon, Maigret sat at his usual table in a small café 2 streets from the Quai des Orfèvres, the sort of place that no longer pretended to be fashionable. The wooden floor creaked when anyone moved, and the coffee tasted faintly of metal. That suited him fine. The rain had slowed to a mist, clinging to the glass panes like breath. He hadn't eaten lunch. There was a plate of bread and cheese in front of him, barely touched, and a glass of beer that had begun to sweat. His coat hung behind him on the chair, heavy with the damp. Across the table, a brown folder lay open. Inside were photographs, grainy, underexposed shots of the man in room 17, and a report from the preliminary post-mortem. Heart failure, it read, in dry medical script. No evidence of trauma. No external wounds. No indication of poison, though full toxicology is pending. No bullet. No hole. No blood. Just a dead man in a chair, and a story about a gunshot that no one else had heard. Maigret lit a cigarette and let the smoke drift between his fingers. Janvier arrived a moment later, shrugging out of his coat. He had a stack of notes with him, damp at the edges. His expression was tired but focused. I went through the call records for the hotel's front line. Nothing from room 17, not even a dial tone at that extension. The phone in the room wasn't plugged in. Old wiring, probably. Maigret nodded but said nothing, and I spoke to the station. We ran Paul Gendreau's name through the archives. Nothing, no priors, no address, no employment records. No birth certificate under that name either, so a false name. Looks that way. He doesn't exist, at least not in the usual way. Maigret took a long drag on his cigarette and glanced out at the mist. And the clothes? Off the rack. Good quality, not new. No tailor's mark. Shoes were Italian, polished recently, but not by a professional. They'd been cleaned, but there was dried mud caught deep in the treads. Not Paris mud, so he'd come from somewhere. Janvier flipped through his notes. We checked nearby hotels, pensions, cafes. No one remembers him. He might have come by train, but we'd need the station cameras, and they don't keep footage long unless requested. Maigret tapped the edge of the folder. He brought no luggage, no wallet, no personal papers. Just a coat, a poetry book, and one glove. Janvier nodded. The glove was left-handed. Leather? Worn but not torn. Maigret didn't answer immediately. He lifted the Prévert book from the folder and opened it. The marked page was a poem called Le Temps Perdu. Time lost, a simple verse. Full of ordinary images, a cafe chair, a hand reaching across the table, rain on an empty street. Prévert wasn't sentimental, he said aloud, but he understood loneliness. Janvier leaned forward slightly. You think the man came to die? Maigret didn't reply, not directly. He turned the page slowly. I think he came to disappear. A silence passed between them, filled only by the soft clink of dishes behind the counter and the quiet murmur of a conversation at the next table. After a moment, Janvier spoke again. There's something else. The concierge, Madame Lemoyne, has a son. Lives just outside Paris. She mentioned him in passing. Works odd jobs, drinks too much. She said he sometimes sleeps in the attic when it's cold, though he's not supposed to. And I made some inquiries. He has a record. Assault, petty theft. Never serious, but enough. Goes by Roland Lemoyne. Maigret nodded slowly. You think he was there that night? Could be. If the concierge lied about who had access to the master key. Maigret stood, folding the folder shut. He left the coins for the coffee and beer on the table and retrieved his coat. I want to see that attic. They returned to the Hotel de la Méridienne just as the light began to fade again. Paris Inn. The hour before dusk always felt suspended, as though the buildings themselves were holding their breath, waiting for night. The concierge was not at her desk. The bell sat untouched. From somewhere behind the door, the radio played a warbling love song. Maigret didn't wait. He motioned for Janvier to follow, and they climbed the narrow staircase past room 17, 2. The top floor where the hallway ended in a crooked wooden door that led to the attic. It wasn't locked. The attic was dusty and low, the ceiling sloped with the shape of the roof. There were crates stacked haphazardly, old linens, broken furniture, and a mattress, thin and yellowed, laid out near the small window that overlooked the street. Beside the mattress was a metal ashtray filled with crushed cigarette butts, Beloises, same brand as Madame Lemoyne, Janvier said. Maigret crouched by the mattress. There was a flask under one of the crates, still half full. He opened it, sniffed. Whiskey. Cheap. He turned toward the wall. There, scratched into the plaster near the baseboard, were faint letters, R.L., etched with a knife or a key. Roland Lemoyne was here. Maybe the night of the death. Maigret didn't answer right away. He looked at the cigarette butts, the flask, the markings on the wall, all the signs of a man who drifted in and out of places without ever truly inhabiting them. He stood slowly. We'll find him. Quietly. I want to speak to him before his mother knows we're looking. As they stepped back into the hallway, Maigret paused outside room 17 again. The door was closed now, cleaned. The man's body had been taken away. The room was once again ready for a stranger to forget themselves in. He stared at the door a moment. "It's possible," he said quietly, "that this man came here to meet someone, not to kill or be killed, just to talk. But something was already broken, and whoever he came to see couldn't fix it." Janvier looked at him. "You think Roland knew him?" "I think someone did. And someone heard something. Whether it was a gunshot or just the sound of a man dying, I don't know yet." He tapped his pipe gently against his coat sleeve and turned toward the stairs. "Let's find Roland." It took Maigret and Janvier the better part of the next day to find Roland Lemoyne. He wasn't listed anywhere formal, not in the registry, not at any fixed address. But Maigret, as ever, had a nose for people who tried to erase themselves without fully succeeding. They always left something behind: a name at a bar, a debt unpaid, a woman tired of their promises. It was in a damp bar off Rue de la Glacière, the sort that smelled permanently of wet wool and sour beer, where the barman finally nodded at the photo Janvier slipped across the counter. "Roland, sure. Comes in now and then. Usually drunk before he gets here. Talks too much when he's had enough. Has a girlfriend near Port d'Orleans, I think. Or used to. Where can we find him?" The barman shrugged. "Depends on who he owes money to." Maigret said nothing. He simply left his card on the bar and nodded once. They were back in the car within minutes, Janvier behind the wheel, the clouds low and flat above them. They found Roland by early evening. He was in a basement flat off Boulevard Jourdan, in a crumbling building with paint flaking from the shutters and a broken letterbox hanging by one hinge. A neighbor let them in. "He's down there," she whispered, "but I won't speak for him. He's not right in the head." The door wasn't locked inside. The place was dark, except for a naked bulb hanging over a small table. Roland sat beneath it, shirtless, smoking with a vacant expression. There were scratches on his arms, old ones, faded, and his face had the worn, greasy pallor of a man who rarely saw daylight. He didn't look surprised to see them. "Police?" Janvier said. "I know," Roland muttered. "You're here about the man." Maigret stepped forward, letting the silence fill the room first. It always did more work than questions. Roland stared at his cigarette, then stubbed it out on the table's edge. "He didn't scream," he said softly. "No," Maigret agreed. "I thought he might." "Who was he?" Roland shrugged. "Some sad bastard. I don't know his name. He came up to the attic 2 nights ago, around midnight. Said he needed to speak with Madame Lemoyne. My mother. I told him she was asleep." "Did you recognize him?" "No, but he spoke like he knew things about my family, about my mother, about me." Janvier leaned forward. "What kind of things?" "Nothing specific, just hints. Like he knew something he wasn't saying. Made me nervous." "Was he angry?" Roland snorted. "No, sad, like someone who's already decided the ending and just wants to say it out loud." Maigret lit his pipe and took a seat across from him. "You said he didn't scream. Why would he?" Roland was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and crossed to a cupboard. He reached behind a loose panel and removed something small, wrapped in a tea towel. He laid it gently on the table. "A gun?" Maigret didn't touch it. "I didn't fire it," Roland said. "But I took it out. I was drunk, I was scared. He was talking in circles, and I thought he was going to try something. So I pulled it out. Waved it. maybe shouted. I don't remember clearly. And the shot? There wasn't one, I don't think. I don't remember pulling the trigger. But later, after he left, I thought I'd heard it. Maybe I dreamed it. Did he leave? Roland looked at him, hollow-eyed. Yes. Walked out of the attic, said nothing. Just nodded like he understood I was afraid. Janvier exchanged a glance with Maigret. And then? Maigret asked. I waited a while, then went down to his room. I had the key. I was going to apologize. I don't know why. Just felt like maybe I should. What did you find? He was sitting in the chair, dead, just like that. Like someone who'd given up halfway through a sentence. Maigret leaned back. The silence in the room was thick now, like dust settling. You took the gun with you? Yes. I panicked. Thought someone might blame me. I hadn't meant anything. I was just drunk and stupid. Maigret nodded slowly. But the concierge said she heard a gunshot. She must have imagined it, Roland muttered. She always thinks something's happening. She hears things no one else does. Maigret stood. You're coming with us. Not under arrest, not yet. But you'll stay close. We'll need your statement. Roland nodded and picked up his coat. He looked smaller now, diminished somehow. Not the kind of man who could lie for long. As they walked out, the street was slick with drizzle again. The lamplight gleamed in the puddles like lost coins. Back at the office, Maigret watched from behind his desk as Janvier processed the weapon. It was an old revolver, Belgian. No recent discharge. Barrel clean. It had not been fired. He leaned back, arms crossed. So the concierge heard something, but the gun wasn't fired. Roland waved it, but never used it. The man went back to his room. Died in that chair. Janvier glanced up. Of what? Maigret tapped his pipe thoughtfully. Of despair, perhaps, or of something older. They were quiet a moment. And the connection to Madame Lemoyne, man? She knows more than she said, Maigret replied. This man. Gendreau, or whoever he was, came to speak to her. He came because of something in the past. Something she never told anyone. Perhaps not even Roland. He stood. I'll speak to her again, but not here, at the hotel. People speak differently in places they know, especially if they've lied there before. Janvier nodded. What are you expecting? Maigret didn't answer right away. He stepped to the window, looking out over the Seine as it slid darkly through the city. Not a confession, he said. Just the part they left out. By late morning, Maigret was once again climbing the narrow stairs of the Hotel de la Meridienne, the same slow creak underfoot, the same faint smell of mildew and polish that couldn't quite mask the scent of age and quiet disappointment. The lobby was empty. No guests, no noise, just the tick of a small wall clock and the hum of an old radiator breathing into the walls. Madame Lemoyne was seated behind the desk as before, arms crossed over her cardigan, her eyes narrowing the moment she saw him. Inspector. Her voice was calm but clipped. Back again. Maigret removed his hat and nodded politely. Always better to ask a second time, madam. People forget things, or remember them better after a night's rest. I already told you everything. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked behind the desk and stood near the little brass rack where the room keys hung, some marked with brittle paper tags, others bare. He picked one up idly, ran his fingers over the smooth. Metal. You've run this place a long time. 32 years, she said, since my husband passed. Hard work. You must know every creak in the floorboards, every trick of the wind. She didn't smile. She didn't move. Just watched him with guarded eyes. He turned to her. And yet you told us you were sure of a gunshot. I was. But it didn't happen. The gun Roland took from the attic wasn't fired. The man had no wounds, no bullet, no trauma. Forensics confirms it. She said nothing. Her lips pressed together, forming a thin line. Your son says he didn't shoot. That the man, whoever he was, left the attic and returned to his room. That he was already dead when Roland followed him. He's lying, she said. Quietly, Maigret's eyebrows lifted. You're certain? She looked away. He's lied before. Maigret waited, watching her. A long silence passed. Outside, a delivery truck rattled by. Somewhere upstairs, a door shut softly. You knew the man, didn't you? He asked finally. She didn't flinch. But her hands, the only part of her that betrayed anything, tightened into fists on her lap. I want to help you, madame. Lemoyne, Maigret said gently. But only if you help me see the full picture. Right now, it's blurred. She looked up then. Not defiant, tired. I hadn't seen him in more than 30 years, she said, her voice rough now. And I wasn't even sure it was him at first. Maigret said nothing, just listened. He came in so quietly. No announcement. No letter, no call. Just walked in off the street like a ghost. He was thinner, older, but the eyes were the same. He didn't give a name, and I didn't ask, but I knew. Who was he? Who was he? She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze wandered to the corner of the lobby, where a rubber plant sagged in a dusty ceramic pot. His name was Lucien Garrel. We were very close, long ago. Before I married, I was 19. He was 21. He came from Montreal. Not much of a man, not really. Dreamer, poet, had ideas about art and escape. I didn't understand them then. You were lovers? For a time. She inhaled through her nose deeply. He left one day. Said he was going to Belgium to write, or paint or something. Never sent a letter, not a word. I assumed he'd died, or that he'd forgotten me. And then he returned. She nodded. Just walked in, asked for a room. Didn't say who he was, but I knew. I offered him tea. He declined. Later that night I couldn't sleep. I came down to check on things. I saw his name in the ledger. Not his real one, of course, but the handwriting. It was the same, delicate, like someone drawing letters instead of writing them. Maigret leaned slightly forward. What did you do? I went up. I knocked. On his door. He didn't answer. I waited. Then I left. And I thought that was it. She paused. Her eyes had become glassy. Not tearful, exactly, but looking somewhere very far away. But that wasn't the end. Maigret said, no, because I heard Roland later, stumbling through the corridor, probably drunk. I went up to the attic and I found the gun missing, and Roland asleep. He wouldn't have fired it. He's never had the courage. And the noise you heard? She hesitated. I don't know. I thought I heard it. Maybe I wanted to. Maybe I thought it would explain why Lucien had come back. Had you kept in touch all these years? No, never. Not a word. Why do you think he came back? She looked up at Maigret then, her gaze steadier than it had been all morning. Because he had no one else. He had nothing. He came to the last place he remembered being loved. Maigret was quiet. He looked around the tired lobby, the chipped tiles, the faded postcards in the corner, a place frozen in time, held together by habit and resignation. "Do you believe Roland scared him to death?" "No," she said softly. "Lucien wasn't scared. He was already gone. Roland just showed him that there was nothing left to wait for." Maigret nodded. He stepped back around the desk. "One last question, madame. Why didn't you say his name? Why pretend you didn't know him?" She exhaled. "Because it felt like betrayal. To admit I had forgotten him, that I had gone on, that I'd loved others, married, had a child. He came back like a wound I thought had healed." Maigret reached for his hat. "Thank you." She looked up again, voice low. "Will you arrest Roland?" "No, but he'll need to answer some questions. He won't go to prison. The law can't punish a man for being confused. And Lucien? We'll confirm his identity, return the body to his family, if there is one." She didn't respond, Dot, as Maigret stepped outside. The air had shifted. The rain had paused. The sky above was the color of tin, but lighter somehow, as if the weight had lifted slightly. He lit his pipe and began walking. No rush. The day was still slow, like an old dog refusing to be hurried. Behind him the Hotel de la Méridien stood, as it always had, tired, persistent, waiting for someone else to disappear inside. Dot. The identification came not from fingerprints, but from something older, quieter, a paper trail, buried deep in civil archives. Janvier, following Maigret's request, had combed through birth registries in Montreuil, digging into the past like an archaeologist in a narrow trench. He returned that afternoon with a slim folder and a face flushed from the cold. "Lucien Garrel," he said, placing the file on Maigret's desk. "Born 1901. Last official trace was in 1924, when he crossed the border into Belgium. A customs report marked him as artist, unmarried, destination Brussels. After that, nothing. No records, no taxes, no residence claims." Maigret opened the folder and scanned the aged documents. Most were handwritten, faded birth and school certificates. A draft notice unfulfilled. "Disappeared in his 20s, Maigret murmured. "Until now." Janvier hesitated, then added, "I also went back to the man's coat from room 17. There was a small tear in the lining, barely visible. Inside, tucked between the stitching, we found this." He handed Maigret a worn, cracked photograph. Dot. It was black and white, slightly out of focus. A younger Madame Lemoyne, unmistakably. Her, though her features were softer then, less braced against life, stood in a park, smiling uncertainly at the camera. Next to her, a man with a long face and a cigarette in one corner of his mouth looked off to the side, disinterested or distracted. Lucien Garrel. Maigret turned the photograph over. On the back, in blue ink, the words, "September 1923, Jardin du Luxembourg." "That's where he carried her," Maigret said. "All this time, tucked into the seam of his coat." Janvier gave a low whistle. She said she hadn't seen him in 30 years. "She hadn't," Maigret said. "But he never left her, not really." He sat back, thoughtful, weighing the photograph between his fingers. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a crime at all. It was a return. A man circling the last warmth he remembered, like a moth to a dying candle. Janvier leaned forward. But then why did he die? Maigret didn't answer right away. He looked past the window to the low clouds over the river. The sky had the pale yellow-gray of ash left too long in a hearth. People forget that death doesn't always need help, he said finally. Sometimes it just waits, watches, and chooses a quiet moment. There was a knock at the office door. Lucas entered, holding a small envelope. "This came for you," he said, handing it to Maigret. "No return address. Dropped at the front desk." Maigret opened it carefully. Inside was a folded note and a second photograph, this one recent. Lucien Garral, in room 17. He was seated in the chair by the window, one hand resting on the sill, the other in his lap. His expression was distant, reflective, as if he were listening to something outside. The frame, the light in the room had caught his eyes just right, giving him a strangely alert look despite the wear of years. Maigret unfolded the note. He didn't come to say goodbye. He came to forgive us both. Tell them not to look for me anymore. Number. Signature. He stared at the message a long moment before folding it again and slipping it back into the envelope. "Madame Lemoyne," he said aloud. Janvier frowned. "You think she took the photo?" "She must have. The timing fits. It was after their brief meeting. She may have followed him back upstairs. Maybe she couldn't bear to speak. Maybe she simply stood in the doorway, watching. And when he was still, she took the picture. A way of capturing the truth she couldn't say." Janvier leaned against the desk. "It's not exactly legal, but it's not exactly a crime either." "No," Maigret agreed. "Just a final moment between two people who failed to finish something. They started long ago." He stood slowly, tucking the photo back into the file. File it all under accidental death, natural causes. "No charges, no pursuit?" Janvier hesitated. "And Roland?" Maigret picked up his coat. "Let him go. Keep an eye on him, if you like, but he's not our concern anymore." As he stepped out of the office, the hallway seemed quieter than usual. Fewer footsteps, less paper rustling, just the slow tick of the bureau around him, like a clock losing time in a familiar rhythm. He went down to the cafe on the corner, not for a meal, but for solitude. A place where a man could sit without needing to speak. He took a seat in the back, where the mirror on the wall reflected half of the room and none of the door. The waiter, familiar with his habits, brought a demi of beer and left him be. Maigret lit a cigarette, stared out through the foggy glass at the street beyond. The weather had turned mild again. The rain held in the clouds, but didn't fall. People moved past slowly, their shoulders hunched, their umbrellas unopened but ready. He thought of Lucien, seated alone in that quiet room. A man who had waited most of his life to return to the scene of something unfinished. A man who came, not to accuse, but simply to be seen one last time. And of Madame Lemoyne, standing silent in the doorway, camera in hand, perhaps crying, perhaps not knowing she would never tell anyone what passed between them. That was how most things ended. In Maigret's experience, not with shouts or revelations, but with silence, regret, the ache of things too long held in the heart. He sipped his beer slowly, letting the silence settle around him. This, too, would pass into the files, into the shelves, into the dust. A man who never fired a bullet, and yet still found his mark. A memory kept in a photograph, a note written too late, and a love buried under years of silence. And outside, the city went on, its heartbeat steady beneath the drizzle that never quite fell. 2 days later, Maigret found himself once again standing in Montparnasse station, a hand on the brass rail that ran along the length of the tiled platform. It wasn't part of the official inquiry anymore. The case, such as it was, had ended. No foul play, no suspect, no arrest. Just a dead man and a quiet truth that refused to shout. Still, something lingered. Not a detail out of place, but rather an absence, like a chair left warm after someone's departure. An emotional indentation that refused to lift. He had taken a slow train that morning, not because it was necessary, but because he preferred the way time passed in carriages that didn't hurry. It gave him space to think, to remember. The station was busy, as it always was, porters hauling luggage, lovers parting awkwardly, children darting too close to the edges. The great iron arch of the ceiling let in streaks of gray morning light. But Maigret wasn't looking at any of that. He was watching a particular bench near platform 4, scarred wood, darkened by countless years of waiting. It was the bench the concierge had mentioned once, offhandedly. He came from the station, I think. That tired way of walking. You see it in men who've sat too long with nothing in their hands but a coat and old thoughts. He imagined Lucien Garrel sitting there, the worn coat folded neatly in his lap, the poetry book in one hand, the single glove in the other, watching trains come and go, watching other people live lives he'd long given up pretending to have. There was no hotel receipt in his pockets, no train ticket, no luggage tag, only the faint smell of tobacco and the echo of a long journey through time rather than space. Maigret approached the bench and sat. The wood was cold, slightly damp, the varnish long worn away. He lit a pipe, even though the sign above him discouraged it. No one stopped him. He puffed quietly, eyes on the tracks. He stayed like that for 10, perhaps 15 minutes, before someone sat beside him. A young woman, early 30s, plain, scarf and wool coat, holding a bouquet of irises wrapped in paper that had started to fray at the corners. She smiled politely, not recognizing him, then turned her gaze down the platform. "You waiting for someone?" Maigret asked after a moment. She shook her head. "No, I was." But he didn't come. A silence passed between them. "It happens," he said softly. She glanced at him. "Do you believe people can come back after too long? I mean not from the dead, but from being gone." He took a slow drag from his pipe. "They come back, but rarely as the people we remember." She nodded, looking at the flowers. "I think that's what happened. He didn't ask her story. He never needed to. People's pain was usually the same shape, even if it wore different clothes." When she stood to leave, she paused. "These are for someone who didn't arrive. If you know someone who could use them." She extended the bouquet with a small smile. "You look like someone who knows a few people." Maigret took them gently. "Thank you." And then she was gone, vanishing into the noise and motion of the station. He looked at the irises, deep violet, slightly wilted, a gentle, unnecessary gesture, the kind that lingered in quiet places like this. He rose and walked the length of the platform once more, passing faces he would never see again. Near the southern exit, he stopped at a kiosk selling newspapers and postcards. He bought neither, but as he turned, he noticed something, An old wooden telephone booth, unused, its door half open. Inside, the receiver hung loosely, swaying slightly. He stepped in. The air inside was stale, full of dust and the faint memory of breath. A crumpled envelope lay on the floor. Someone had stepped on it. He bent, picked it up. No address. Just a torn scrap of paper inside. He opened it. He said her name before he sat down. That's how I knew it was real. That was all. No. Signature. No date. Maigret held the paper between his fingers for a moment, then folded it neatly and placed it in his coat pocket, alongside the photograph of Lucien and Madame Lemoyne. He wasn't sure if the note had been meant for him. Perhaps it was. Meant for no one. Or perhaps it had been there waiting for someone to care enough to notice it. Outside the booth, the sky had started to clear. The sunlight broke through in slivers, gilding the iron beams above. Maigret left the station and walked toward the Rue de la Gaîté, where the theater still stood half asleep during the day. He passed the Café Pierrot and stopped for a coffee. Sitting at the window where he could see the passing trams, the flowers sat in the center of the table. The waiter looked at them, but said nothing. He drank slowly, savoring the warmth. His mind was with Lucien again, that strange man with no past, who had come to Paris not for redemption, but for presence. Not to demand, but to witness. To exist just once more where something had mattered. Maigret thought about the stories that never made it to the reports. The small aches, the missed trains, the letters never sent. Most cases, he realized, weren't crimes. They were collisions. Between memory and regret, between silence and truth. Lucien had fired no bullet. But he had left behind something far more permanent, a silence that needed to be understood. A death with no cause but time, and perhaps too much hope. When he finished his coffee, Maigret rose, left coins on the table, and carried the flowers back to the station. He found the bench again, now empty, and set them down in the center, not as a tribute, but as a placeholder for all the words never spoken. Then he walked away, back into the city, back into the slow rhythm of footsteps and questions that didn't always have answers. The final threads of the case, if one could still call it that, were thinning now, unraveling not through any grand discovery, but through something simpler, slower, a shifting of perspectives, of emotional weight. The official reports were nearly done, and yet Maigret remained restless, as though a conversation had been interrupted and never resumed. He returned to the Hotel de la Méridien late. In the afternoon, rain again, but gentler this time, a mist that drifted rather than fell. The building looked unchanged, the way these places always did, too still, too unwilling to acknowledge what had passed within them. The lobby was empty. Madame Lemoyne was not at her usual station. The bell sat untouched. No radio this time, only the faint tick of the clock and the occasional murmur of pipes groaning in the walls. Jacet, the young maid, appeared at the top of the stairs, carrying a mop and a metal bucket. She nearly dropped both when she saw him. "Oh," she said, catching her breath. "I didn't know you were. It's all right," Maigret said gently. "I just wanted a word." She hesitated, then set the bucket down and wiped her hands on her apron. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, eyes wide, defensively. "No, I don't think you did. But you saw something, didn't you?" She blinked, swallowed. "No, I mean, not really. Only through the keyhole." Maigret gave her a moment, letting the silence settle. She glanced around nervously, as if afraid Madame Lemoyne might appear from one of the doorways and scold her. He gestured toward the stairs. "Shall we sit in the attic a moment? It's quieter there." She hesitated again, then nodded. They climbed together, slowly, and stepped into the narrow attic space. The mattress was still there, the crates, the yellowing wallpaper curling at the corners. A shaft of pale light came through the slanted window, catching dust in the air. Josette sat on a stool, hands in her lap. Maigret remained standing. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me what you saw. All of it. No one will blame you." Her voice was soft, hesitant. "I wasn't spying." "Not really." "I was cleaning upstairs and heard voices. It was late. After midnight, I went to the landing. The door to the attic was cracked. I saw the man go in, the one who died. I didn't know his name, but I remembered his coat. He walked past me earlier that evening. Did he say anything?" "Not to me. Just knocked on the attic door." Roland opened it. He was drunk, as usual. They spoke quietly, argued a little. Nothing loud. Then I heard Roland shout something, and I looked through the keyhole. Maigret said nothing. He waited. He was holding a gun, she whispered. Roland pointed it at the man, but he didn't shoot, just waved it, like a child playing gangster, and the man didn't move, just looked at him. Afraid? No, sad, like someone who'd already lived through worse. Maigret nodded slightly. "And then?" "The man left, didn't say anything, just turned and walked down the stairs." She stopped, biting her lip. "There's more." She looked up at him, her voice barely above a breath. "I came down later. I couldn't sleep. The concierge door was shut, but there was a light on. I went toward the guest room, room 17, and the door was ajar, just a little. Enough to see inside." Maigret's gaze didn't waver. "He was sitting in the chair," she continued. "The man still, but he was alive." "You're sure?" She nodded. His hand moved, very slowly, just once. Then it stopped. I waited. I don't know how long. Then the concierge appeared. She must have heard me. She stood behind me, didn't say anything, just looked inside. Then she gently pushed the door closed. "And said nothing?" "She told me to go upstairs, that she'd handle it." Maigret let out a slow breath. "So he died not alone, but in silence." Josette's eyes welled. "I think he was waiting for someone." He was. They sat a moment longer in the attic, the dust swirling gently in the golden shaft of light. Then Maigret rose. "Thank you, Josette. You've helped." She nodded quickly, brushing her eyes with the back of her hand. "I didn't mean to hide anything." "You didn't." He left her there and descended the stairs. In the lobby, Madame Lemoyne was back behind her desk. She looked up sharply as he approached, reading something in his expression. "You spoke to the girl," she said. Maigret nodded. She saw more than she realized. "She's too soft," Madame Lemoyne muttered. "Sees everything like a story." "Perhaps. But stories are how people survive things they don't understand." Madame Lemoyne lit a cigarette and said, "Nothing." He looked at her a long moment. "You watched him die." She didn't flinch. "Yes. Why? Because he wanted someone to." "That's why he came back." Maigret nodded. "He didn't judge her. There was no need. You could have spoken to him. No, she said simply. Not then. There was nothing left to say, only to be present. Maigret tapped the counter gently with his fingers, then turned to leave. But at the door he paused. He carried your photo for 30 years. She didn't respond, but her shoulders dropped slightly. He left her with that dot outside. The mist had turned to sun, the streets glistening with faint reflections. The city breathed again. Quietly. Maigret walked toward the nearest tata and bought a pack of matches. Then he made his way to the quay, the Seine rolling on in its usual indifference. He leaned against the rail, lit his pipe, and watched the water dot. There were no more questions. Only the quiet knowledge of things endured. A love that hadn't lasted, a death that hadn't shouted, and a truth that had waited years for someone to bear witness. The case had ended, though Maigret was never the kind of man to feel that cases truly ended. They faded, softened, dissolved into the background of his mind, like old wallpaper patterns in forgotten rooms. What remained weren't facts or even names, but moments, gestures, silences, unfinished sentences. That evening, as dusk spilled quietly across Paris, Maigret walked home alone along Boulevard Richard Lenoir. The rain had returned, but not with force. It whispered on the pavement and made halos of light around the gas lamps. People moved past him with umbrellas half open, collars turned up. The city, like him, seemed to be bracing against something. Unnamed. He hadn't written a formal report. There was little to report. Lucien Garrow, if that name still meant anything, had died of natural causes. In a rented room he chose on purpose, in a building he remembered from another life. No bullet, no blood, no violence. Only the idea of something that might have been a reunion, a confrontation, perhaps forgiveness, that passed like smoke through the hands of those left behind. He stopped at the corner bakery before reaching home. The warm air inside was thick with sugar and yeast, the smell of things that made life slightly easier to bear. He bought a small almond tart and a loaf of bread. Madame Maigret liked tart on cool evenings, even if she never asked for it. When he reached the apartment, he paused on the stairs a moment, listening. He could hear her moving in the kitchen, not bustling, not hurrying, but the familiar rhythm of plates being set, a spoon stirring something in a pot, the radio humming a lullaby from the past. He entered quietly. "You're late," she called, without turning. There was no reason to rush, he said, removing his coat and hat. He placed the tart on the counter and kissed her cheek. She smiled, then turned off the stove. He didn't speak of the case. He rarely did. But as they sat down to eat, he mentioned something that had been turning in his mind. "Do you think people change?" He asked Dot. She looked up, surprised. "Why do you ask?" "I'm not sure." A man came back to a place he'd left a long time ago. He was searching for something. I think he believed he hadn't changed, but everything around him had. She thought about it a moment, then said, "We change, yes, but mostly we forget the parts of ourselves we don't like to remember." He nodded and buttered his bread. After dinner, he stood by the window and lit his pipe. The rain had become a fine mist, falling evenly, painting the streets with a sheen that caught the yellow light. A cat slipped along the edge of the sidewalk, unnoticed, Dot in his pocket. He still carried the photograph, Lucien and the young woman who had become Madame Lemoyne. a memory etched in paper and time. He turned it over once more, reread the inscription. September 1923, Jardin du Luxembourg. A date. A place. Two faces that hadn't known how far apart they would drift. He imagined Lucien returning with that photo tucked in his coat, walking the same streets with shoes too clean, hands too still. No plan, no hope for absolution. Just a final act of presence. That was what haunted Maigret, in the quiet way things did, the knowledge that it wasn't guilt that killed Lucien Garel, nor fear, it was distance. Time stretched too far to hold meaning, and yet, in the end, he had found a room, and a chair, and a window with rain on the glass. And he had found the woman he once loved, even if only from across a room. Maigret understood that, perhaps more than he cared to admit behind him, Madame Maigret had begun knitting, a rhythmic click of needles like distant footsteps on cobblestones. He looked out once more at the rain-slicked street. In another part of the city, Madame Lemoyne was likely sitting behind her reception desk, the lobby once again dim, the key rack once again still. Perhaps Josette had gone home. Perhaps she hadn't. Perhaps Roland was wandering the streets, trying not to think. Maigret imagined him lighting a cigarette with trembling hands, the revolver long surrendered, the chain still heavy. But there was no villain, no one to blame. Only people left standing after something they didn't fully understand had passed through their lives. He turned from the window, emptied his pipe into the ashtray, and sat beside his wife. She looked over her glasses at him and smiled. "Do you want me to cut the tart?" "In a moment," he said. "Let's sit just a little longer." They sat in silence as they had done for so many years, not because there was nothing to say, but because the things worth saying didn't always need to be spoken. Outside, Paris continued as it always had. Somewhere in the dark, a train pulled into a station. A door closed. A letter remained unwritten. A life long paused, flickered briefly and disappeared, and Maigret, quiet in his chair, let the story rest, not solved, not conquered, but understood.